All right, 3:40. Wow. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is you should recognize that there wasn't any assigned homework, no chapter or reviews or anything like that for this particular class, and that is partly because your book doesn't really talk about whiteness and whiteness studies in the academic sense. So I'm kind of in the sort of interest of kind of talking about the origins and significance of racial identities at the interpersonal level. I thought I'd take a moment to break away from your core book just for this week to talk about whiteness and whiteness studies and what it has to do with white supremacy. Okay, so generally that's kind of just the focus for today. But on the time that we meet, I think the following Monday, you should be aware that there are 4 extended readings, and we're going to be devoting the entire class period to discussing just those readings. And it's about 60 pages or so worth of material. So I would encourage you to do the reading and come prepared. Absolutely do not do the reading at the last minute, and certainly don't submit your assignments at the last minute. The other thing I noticed, students brought this to my attention, is one of the assigned readings, please listen to me and recognize that I'm saying this now, because if you send me an email asking about it, I'm going to tell you that I told you in class. One of the readings, the author's name is Fears, and the file link, the PDF link to this particular reading is not under this person's last name. Unfortunately, the PDF was named after the title of the reading, so the file that you're looking for is called Hue and Cry on Whiteness. Okay, so that is the Fears reading. Just know that I did explain that to you. I'm making note of it now. Yeah, okay. So basically the way that I'm going to go about doing this, I'm going to be synthesizing a lot of scholarly information and academic information about whiteness. No, I myself am not a white person. I can't possibly speak from the lived personal experience of what it means to be white. So all of the things that I'm talking about here, at least in reference to the experiences that white people have, the origin of their identity, the significance of their racial experience, and these things therein, I am compiling a body of academic knowledge and information. And hopefully by the end of this lecture, you'll kind of clearly see that. I'm going to start off this lecture by, first of all, just talking about the origins of whiteness studies as an academic field from the perspective of anthropology. There are other respective origins of whiteness studies, or the interest, the academic interest in the topic of whiteness. But really, again, because I'm the anthropologist, that's just kind of the way that we're going to be approaching this. So we'll talk about, start off by talking about whiteness studies from the lens of anthropology. And then from there, we'll just dive into a synthesis of whiteness as a concept, and then several academic concepts or terms related to whiteness studies, including white fragility, white rage, or white anger. And then lastly, we'll leave off this talk with white supremacy. Okay? Okay, I like to keep key terms here, and that is because even though there's not like a chapter that you can reference for these key terms, I still want you to know and be familiar with these key topics, okay? So when you see these and you get the slides, please know that these key terms are fair game. Do also know that while I do not have a specific slide on the good-bad binary, like with textual information, there is a video that we will be watching that explains the good-bad binary, and so I do want you to understand that concept as well, okay? So if you need to, you'll do your best to go back to the video and rewatch it if you need to. Okay, I like to start off this particular topic by just asking students, like with a show of hands, how many of you prior to this class knew that whiteness studies was an actual field of study in academics, in research, in humanities, in sociology? None of you. Wow. So let that kind of speak to the example. Yeah. Tell me.
You mean whiteness studies? Do you mean like a formal name, whiteness studies, or like just studies on whiteness in general?
So whiteness studies as akin to African American studies or Latin American studies or Asian American studies, that kind of thing. Were you aware that whiteness studies was in fact something devoted to understanding whiteness through this lens?
Yes, I was. I think I was aware of that. Yes, yes.
Okay. All right, but most of you weren't for some reason, and yet you're all aware. Like in this class, you're aware that this is an African American studies class, right? We have a Latin American studies program. We have ethnic studies, right? In general, and yet there's seldom attention drawn to the topic of whiteness in this academic regard. Part of that, let that connect back to what we were talking about in terms of living in a hegemonic culture in which the views and perspectives of the dominant group are often rendered invisible, and all of the experiences therein are treated as the default norm and therefore rendered invisible. Well, the invisibility and the lack of awareness around whiteness studies goes well beyond this classroom. Most people in America are woefully unaware that whiteness studies, this has been a topic of study for decades. And most people, even today, are still unaware of that fact. So don't feel isolated, don't feel alone or anything like that. But I often like to ask that, and that's particularly because I would go so far as to say there is a kind of intentional effort to keep people from turning their awareness and their attention academically and scientifically to the topic of whiteness in the same ways that we turn our attention to African American studies or Latin American studies or these kinds of things. Okay, so in general, from the anthropological lens, right? We've already established that anthropology is the study of human beings. The study of human beings as biological beings, as linguistic beings, as cultural beings. And so most anthropologists, first of all, the field of anthropology is very white dominated. It almost always has been. I would go so far as to say anthropology is still very much white dominated field today. But in general, most anthropologists are generally interested in studying human beings in their most natural environments. That usually means that their focus of attention is on human beings that are indigenous, that live in the wild somewhere, that are kind of separated from the notions of civility and sovereignty that we know of in the developed, globalized world, right? And so a number of the anthropologists that you see on the screen, Napoleon Chagnon, Jacques Lizotte, Kenneth Good, for example. These are anthropologists who kind of hit the height of their career around the late 80s, early 90s, where they would go and study and build relationships with the Yanomami people. These are people in South America or the indigenous Amazon rainforests. And many of them, they would write lots of publications, create documentaries or like film series about these people and try to educate the Western society or Western audiences about their perspectives and their engagements and their encounters with these indigenous people. Okay, so Napoleon Chagnon, for his time, was kind of the pioneer of a lot of this work, and that would slowly follow Jacques Lizotte coming from France and also working with the Yanomami to study the development of their language. And then ultimately Kenneth Good kind of following suit as well to develop close relationships with these people and to understand them in an anthropologically meaningful sense. But lots of deep-rooted questions started to emerge as these people develop more and more closer relationships with them. I'll give you an example. For example, Kenneth Good spent so much time with the Yanomami and became so acculturated to their society, fluent in their language, fluent in their customs, that eventually he was just kind of welcome as one of their own. And as welcome as one of their own, these people eventually gave him a bride. And so in their customs, in their culture, brides are given usually to men as little girls. So he is a Western scholar from the United States that essentially is a part of this tribe, so to speak, and ends up marrying a young 12-year-old girl and spends years with this young 12-year-old girl to the point that eventually they would have children of their own. This is the young woman that would ultimately grow up with him into an adult and become his wife. Some years later, they returned back to the United States, as you can clearly see with the kinds of clothes they're wearing in the house behind them. They returned back to the United States, and this became a topic of ethical debate, of anthropological debate around the problems of a Western scholar going into another culture and then marrying a young 12-year-old girl, which is significantly taboo for our society while it's normative for hers. Some years after they spent time in the US, I forget her name, you'll have to forgive me, but she decided that it's not natural for human beings to live in boxes the ways that Western society does. And ultimately she returned back to the Amazon forest, to her native people, but she left her children behind who eventually grew up, became acculturated to the United States, and then went back into the Amazon years later to go and return and reunite with her and those kinds of things. Right? So there's one aspect of very important, deep questions being raised about some important implications we'll get to in a moment. Then there was the issue with Jacques Lizotte. This is a French anthropologist who's going in and he has developing close relationships with these natives. But then in so doing, the natives keep articulating to other Westerners that for some reason Jacques Lizotte has a sexual interest in their young boys and likes to fondle them. Right? And so Western scholars took this as accusations. They often belittled the experiences and perspectives of the native people, particularly because the native people don't really have a notion of like pedophilia. They don't really understand the harm with it, although they get the feeling that there's something wrong. They don't necessarily know how to articulate it. So most Western scholars who had the power to intervene ended up just defaulting to whatever Jacques Lizotte explained to them. But this also raised some very deep questions. More importantly, between Kennegood and Napoleon Chagnon, there was this kind of ongoing battle about the ways that they're writing about these people. Napoleon Chagnon would often use language that characterized these people as like savages of the bush, for example, mischaracterizing their humanity in a way that would certainly appeal to your typical racist Western audience, but might draw ethical problems if they ever caught on to the kinds of language that was being used to describe them. Right? And so collectively, I give you all of these examples not because I want to say, oh, well, whiteness is about pedophilia. That's not my point. But rather about there was an unspoken assumption, an implicit assumption with regard to a lot of these researchers going into the Amazon to study these groups of people. Do you know what that unspoken assumption is? Or was, rather? You want to guess? Yeah.
That they're like inferior to them or are different than them in a way?
Perhaps an unspoken assumption would be to some extent they're inferior, but let's draw attention to the scholars themselves. What might most people be assuming about these scholars? Let's say epistemologically, methodologically when it comes to research. Science strives to be objective. And the unspoken assumption was that perhaps by virtue of just being white men, their assessments of these native people is like objective, right? And it's free from error, free from bias, and ultimately because of the emergence of a lot of these, let's say, ethical conflicts that come from the clash of cultural values and the taboos therein, it began to draw interest and attention. Well, what if we turned anthropology on the white scholar? What if instead of anthropology simply being studying indigenous black and brown people, what if we use the same tools and techniques to then study what it means to even be white? Right? Because everybody seems to be operating with this assumption that by virtue of these scholars being white, they can come in and they can do scientific research without bias, without error, without problem, and that's clearly not the case. Right? If you're interested in any of these perspectives, there's a documentary, I forget the name of it, but you're welcome to look up these names and you will inevitably find the documentary. It's fairly interesting and it's about these three. Okay, and so that leads to what would contribute ultimately to the emergence of the formalizing of the field of whiteness studies, an academic field, not necessarily with the intent to make white people look like white devils and as evil as possible. That's not the case, but rather to critically analyze the topic of whiteness. Understanding that it is social construction, and by virtue of being social construction, in what ways does whiteness operate as an unnamed norm? as an unnamed standard from which we often view other non-white people to be inferior relative to their degrees of difference away from whiteness. Does that make sense? Okay. And then how does whiteness kind of serve to maintain racial hierarchies that have always existed since the time of the birth of the United States? And so this draws a critical lens to examining the function of whiteness in relation to all other non-white identities. Okay. So this is how we get to the topic of whiteness. Well, what does whiteness mean? Well, first of all, we're talking about white people. Right? And whiteness on its own then would then refer to their customs, perhaps their beliefs, perhaps their culture. Yes, white people have culture. Yes, white people have customs, believe it or not, whether you don't believe me or not, that is true. But how all of these things work in tandem or work together to comprehensively operate as the standard from which we view all others. Okay? So now, hopefully, you can see the significance of whiteness studies, particularly in relation to anthropology, but then also the ways that other non-white people tend to be racialized, right? Okay. So if whiteness then is operating as the normalized standard, what does that mean about white racial identity? What does that mean about white racial identity formation or the development of white racial identity in comparison or contrast to American history? And how is it that we have managed to create a culture where non-white people are traditionally seen as inferior, perhaps defective or abnormal in some way in comparison to whiteness? How is it that we've developed a culture where we assume that a white person, just purely by virtue of, say, being a white male scientific scholar, somehow has objectivity that no one else seems to have access to, right? How is it that we've developed that kind of culture? So this is where whiteness studies kind of becomes its own derivative from critical race studies, right? Where we are then closely analyzing the ways in which whiteness simply operates in Western society. And I would go so far as to say globalized society. But in the context of African American studies, we're talking about generally the US. Okay. The late author and poet Toni Morrison has this quote here where she says, "In this country, American means white and everyone else has to hyphenate." Does anyone want to offer up their interpretation of what they think this might mean?
It's like the idea that if you're a white person in the US, you can just call yourself American. But like, for example, if you're of Mexican descent, you say that you're Mexican American or you're African American, something like that. Absolutely.
And so what would you interpret the sort of social, cultural implication to be there?
I think that the implication is that it kind of like others or differentiates people based on if they have to hyphenate. So you kind of get like a basic, like, oh, you're just like American, and then you're like, oh, you're something else added on where you're just like, you're not purely American, there's something else going on there.
Yeah, and the emphasis is on putting your race or your color or your origin first before your national origin, where for some reason, unspoken reason, white people simply don't have to do that. The implication here is that our culture tends to center whiteness as the norm, from which they are simply American, and then all others who are non-white have to emphasize and denote their particular skin color or origin of some kind, their racial identity, before they even get to affiliate with American in the same ways that whiteness does. Right? So this creates a kind of unique cultural phenomenon where a lot of white people, certainly not all white people, but a lot of white people in the US rarely have to think about their racial identity. They don't have to think about it in the ways that they identify with themselves. They certainly don't have to carry this notion that they have a racial identity and a racialized experience with them wherever they go, kind of over their heads, so to speak, right? It is to live in a culture in which one has never really needs to exercise much effort or energy expenditure to reflect on the ways in which they have their own unique racialized experience. The unspoken assumption there then is that by virtue of never really having to think about these things or reflect on these things, that this should in fact be the norm. The norm should in fact be that no one should have to reflect on their racial identity. No one should have draw attention to their racialized experience, or even to necessarily speak about these things lest they become the racist. Right? It creates a unique social dynamic where the expectation is that by virtue of the white experience being centered as the normative one, it becomes abnormal to put so much emphasis on one's racial identity or cultural belonging. And that in order to maintain peace in American society, we need to kind of silence these notions and kind of conform to the standards of expectation that would otherwise be regarded as normative in comparison to a white experience. Okay. So within the field of whiteness studies, you get several key concepts, right? Obviously, first of all, I've already said this because I like jumping ahead of myself. I can't help it. That whiteness studies is a kind of derivative of critical race studies. And so by virtue of being a derivative of critical race studies, whiteness studies on its own implicitly understands that race is still socially constructed, that what we're calling white has no biological validity, the same as all other racial identity groups. But within the realm of social construction, how does whiteness function to influence social and political reality? Right? Because that's still having a real world effect, despite the fact that we can recognize that racial identities are a biological fiction. We then understand, again, because I've already jumped ahead of myself, I keep doing that, that whiteness is centered as the norm, from which whiteness is operating as a standard or an invisible norm from which it has little to no significance, and in fact, drawing significance to the topic of whiteness or white identity is a fairly uncomfortable experience. Right? We've also talked about this last week. I've already explained to you that even our ability to describe or discuss white privilege doesn't necessarily center this phenomenon of guilt, but that white privilege, as operating by the default standard, centers a kind of privilege in which one doesn't actually need to exert that much energy to reflect on their own racial identity, and then to perhaps, because they live in let's say, a society that benefits and privileges whiteness, receives the social benefits and advantages of that whiteness. That often means they are not, their racial identity is not a barrier to their success in any way, right? So this is what we mean when we talk about, or what I mean, rather, when I talk about unearned advantages and benefits, right? So kind of all things I have I've already described to you, right? Okay, so I have this thought experiment, this exercise here. This is not a litmus test. I don't want anyone to raise their hand and say, ooh, me, I relate to this, or something like that. But this is a thought experiment where I'm going to read aloud a compilation of several revelations that other whiteness study scholars have realized for themselves in examining or critically examining their own racial identity. Obviously, there are lots of examples of, here that are only going to relate to the person, but kind of comprehensively, they speak to the nature with which white privilege can occur. This is an exercise that is particularly useful for my white identifying students, but I encourage everybody to entertain this regardless of how you identify. I call this exercise the things that white privilege affords me. Okay, so I'm going to read these things out loud, and then on the back end of this, I'd love to get some thoughts, comments, chime in, that kind of thing. Okay, so first and foremost, I can, if I wish, arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I can avoid spending time with people whom I was trained to mistrust and who have learned to mistrust my kind or me. If I should need to move, I can be pretty sure of renting or purchasing housing in an area which I can afford and in which I would want to live. I can be pretty sure that my neighbors in such a location will be neutral or pleasant to me. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or harassed. I can turn on the TV or open the front page of the newspaper and see people of my race widely represented. When I am told about our national heritage or about civilization, I am shown that people of my color made it what it is. I can be sure that my children will be given curricular materials that testify to the existence of their race. I can be pretty sure of having my voice heard in a group in which I am the only member of my race. I can be casual about whether or not to listen to another person's voice in a group in which they are the only member of their race. Can I get your thoughts on this? Anyone? To share their perspectives? Yeah, can I get the mic, Karen? Thank you.
I feel like something that's like relatively like repeating itself is that how white people can just like move around to different places without really having to think about like, oh, like would I fit in?
Yeah.
Like the fit in mold,
Yeah,
I
sure.
guess.
Yeah, that's part of it. Can I get someone else? Yeah.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of them also depend on like your income and how much money you have, because like a lot of the time, like where like if you have, I think if you have a lot of money, a lot of those things can be possible, and if you don't, like if you're living paycheck to paycheck, then it's harder to, like you're not gonna really have as much options as to where you live or like how much you're eating or like stuff like that. So
Sure.
I think that's like a big factor.
Sure, absolutely. One more person. Get your participation credit. Yeah. Can I? Yeah. Thank you.
I was going to say a lot of these things are less based on like existing laws or like specific things that you can point to. It's more just like culturally how things are formed, and it's
Sure.
more just kind of how things are based on human nature
Yeah.
than anything else.
Sure. But it's the freedom to move, the freedom to relocate, the sight of seeing repeated images of yourself or people who look like you anyway, celebrated and given the credit for the hallmarks of major achievements in humankind and human history, right? Perhaps it is the freedom not to fear that if you move or relocate to another neighborhood that people are going to be welcome to you. You don't even really have to think about those kinds of things. Right? It's kind of like that. And then when we talk about the white experience in America, right? The white American experience, we're not just talking about white people in general, because in the United States, we still center whiteness as this sort of default norm, and to an extent, whiteness and white racial identity is in essence rendered invisible, shedding a spotlight on the topic of race, but then more importantly, the topic of whiteness generally tends to be uncomfortable for white Americans. And particularly when it comes to race in general, but then more importantly, white racial identity in the United States. And I think it was even articulated in this class, if I'm not mistaken, that generally, at least notions of whiteness tend to see race as something that other people have. Other people are cultured, other people have racial identity, but whiteness is often articulated to be a kind of uncultured, right? Doesn't have racial identity, rather sees white people as individuals, or sees white people just as people rather than necessarily as white people. And then generally most white Americans are kind of raised to see race and racism as individual acts of prejudice, individual acts of discrimination that are intentional. It is conscious dislike, conscious hate. That a person must intentionally choose to engage in and entertain and perpetuate and display. And because they're raised to see racism in this way, it often then means that racism becomes synonymous with bad. Right? That to be in proximity to racism, to entertain topics of race, racial identity, perhaps to draw the spotlight to one's own whiteness, and any of the conversations that may come from that spotlight automatically makes that person a bad person. And this often leads to a surplus of defensive moves that we would call fragility. I'll talk about fragility, I believe, in the slide after this one. right? But in general, because everybody, this is not necessarily a white person thing, but just by virtue of being human, we all see ourselves as good people, right? It means then that for white Americans in particular, because they naturally see themselves as good people, as all human beings do, they don't necessarily then see themselves connected to race or connected to racism or having any significant experiences with race or racism, lest if they are connected to it in some way, it must be because it is a bad thing, right? So often then, what happens comprehensively is that white identity is rendered invisible, and shedding a spotlight on those things becomes uncomfortable. Talking about race in general or emphasizing racial diversity in general is generally uncomfortable to white Americans, and it triggers a range of defensive moves that seek to remove the spotlight away from whiteness, or away from the topic of whiteness, and away from everyone's attention about whiteness. And those range of defensive moves we would then characterize as what is termed white fragility. This is an academic term to describe the phenomenon of white people often engaging in defensive moves or dodging the topic of race, dodging perhaps proximity to race or distancing themselves from proximity to racism, doing what they can to maintain white identity as a standard norm that is rendered invisible on the racial front, okay? So when we talk about white fragility, again, this is an academic term, not just a term that's just kind of made up and thrown around loosely. It tends to be the case that conversations around anti-racism, conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, for example, these kinds of things can be very triggering to specific kinds of white people who seek to silence these discussions or minimize the significance of these discussions, because to some extent, by shedding light on the topic of race and racial diversity, particularly in the context of American history, it often makes white people feel guilty, like they are an accomplice, like they have contributed to whatever racial harm is being discussed, which is, again, not necessarily the case. But I would even implore you then to consider the major moves that the current presidential administration is making on the DEI front, right? Let that be your textbook example of what fragility looks like, right? Okay, so in general, it will tend to be the case, at least in America, not necessarily in Europe and other places, but at least in America, whiteness does often receive a kind of historical or traditional racial advantage. And because of that, because attention can be drawn to those racialized advantages that are often unspoken or unnamed or expected to be considered as the norm, it often means then that drawing attention to those advantages must reveal the white person by virtue of their identity to be a bad person, and so therefore it triggers a range of defensive moves around that discomfort that seek to either derail or avoid or minimize these otherwise fruitful discussions. And ultimately, that defensive move or the defensive moves that white Americans may engage in is often because they want to distance themselves from the association of being a bad person, which is often at the center of a lot of racialized discussions, or often an implicit assumption that if one is in proximity to race or racism, that makes them a bad person. Hopefully, it's already been clear that we've established in this class that everybody's racist. I'm racist. Racist, you're racist, everybody's racist, and that doesn't necessarily make us a bad person. But in most layperson society, like, you know, just common discussions around race and the like, it is generally understood that racism is in fact synonymous with bad, that then triggers this range of defensive moves or fragility, right? It also tends to be the case that in general, white people do not like being generalized. They often prefer to be seen as individuals, as just human beings, who are not necessarily, their racial identity is not necessarily dictated by the unique or extreme actions of another white person, to much of the same way that perhaps the unique or extreme actions of one particular person of color then sets the stage for how we view all other people that are associated with that same racial identity, right? So on this front then, perhaps comments or questions around why do white people like to do blah? Or why don't white people prefer to see da-da-da? I'm just kind of making things up. These kinds of questions that seek to group white people together are generally regarded as racist or bad, and so are therefore dismissed. But often in whiteness studies, it's not necessarily the goal to generalize white people, but to understand the unique characteristics around the phenomenon of whiteness that kind of comprehensively articulates or describes the experience of white people. Okay, so then often when attention around whiteness triggers this kind of fragility, you'll see a range of moves. Some of them we'll talk about because they're described in the readings. You'll also see a few examples of videos in which the range of these defensive moves are engaged in. It tends to hinder productive and meaningful conversations about the topic of race, and usually leads to us really getting nowhere in terms of developing a more expansive understanding of racism, particularly in American society. Okay. I kind of developed this, it's called the White Fragility Prayer. This is a psychosocial model that I'm currently developing. It's built off of the work of Robin DiAngelo. This is one of the whiteness scholars whose readings you're assigned for this particular topic. And it's around the sort of, it's characterizing a kind of predictive model of what you can often expect a white person to articulate if they are found in proximity to racism. I would also go so far as to say this particular psychosocial model is not only applicable at the individual level, but is also applicable at the institutional or organizational level as well. And I'll give you a few examples of that. You can clearly see I've got some links ready to go, right? But the psychosocial framework of white fragility kind of works like this. I call this the White Fragility Prayer. It goes, racism exists, but not here. And if it's here, it's not me. And if it was me, I didn't mean it. And if I meant it, it's not racist, or I'm not racist. That's just how it is. It's a way in which no matter how close the racism might actually be in proximity to a person who might in fact be perpetuating racism in some harmful way, there's always an effort to distance oneself from it. Right? I want to give you some examples of what the White Fragility Prayer looks like in action. And for this, I want to show you a video. Okay? Not this video just yet. In this video, okay, this is a social media influencer. Her name is Florence Mirsky, excuse me. And watch what she does in this video and listen to what she says.
For blatant racism towards a Hispanic man.
You're a wetback. What else? I have wetback. What else? Trump is doing good things. Yeah. You guys can kill people.
Right?
Take your $50 and send it. Give me my change. I'm rich, you're poor. Difference.
You're a poor soul.
Yep, you're poor.
You're a poor soul.
You want to report me? How come I didn't touch you? Bitch, go. Give my keys.
The woman was like,
All right. So in this video, this is a video that obviously it ends up on social media. It makes its rounds. People are sharing it. Her job ends up seeing it. She's kind of getting the pressure that you would expect for somebody who's acting out in a video like this to get. Using the psychosocial model of the White Fragility Prayer, what would you expect her response to be after the social media fallout? Could you predict what you would expect to hear her say? Yeah. Can I get wherever the mic is? Yeah, can we pass that over? Thank you. Yeah, what would you expect her to say?
She'd probably get really defensive and say that it didn't have to do with race and more so the individual that she was talking to.
Perhaps something like that. No, can I get, sorry. I know it's a little bit of a hassle. I'm sorry.
This has definitely happened on social media before. I feel like some people just go on there and just apologize, going off that. But it's more of like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. Like, that was my fault, like owning up to it. Or there's also that side of it. So either one way or the other.
Sure. On the racial front, what might you expect her to say? If she has to distance herself from racism as far as possible, Can I get, sorry, yeah?
I don't really know how you distance yourself from racism at that point.
Yeah.
But I feel like people definitely do try to say like, oh, I was just upset and like, you know, I'm not racist. I don't actually think that. Because I mean, what else can you say at that point? Like,
All right, here's her response.
DMs and the comments. I left my house yesterday in PJs, as you can tell, looking crazy. And when I was walking out of a scrub, the valet guy grabbed my ass and I should have just punched him. I was thinking about my child and not wanting to go to jail. So I lashed out and I called him a wetback. And I'm so wrong for that, but I felt so violated. I should have just shut my mouth, called the police, and that's it. So basically, I'm explaining to everybody, I am sorry for what I said. I've been around Mexicans, dated Mexicans my whole life. My parents are immigrants. I am the farthest thing from racist possible.
I'm the furthest thing from racist possible. I have Mexican friends. My parents are immigrants. I'm a good person, right? What she's truly trying to say is, I am not a bad person, right? And you can hear part of where she's trying to articulate that, at least in her words, although her behavior would clearly suggest a little bit otherwise, perhaps. You can clearly hear that she's synonymizing racism with bad. And then even in the case of like a textbook example of individualized racist behavior, she's still making the effort to distance herself as far away from it, even though it's her own behavior, right? Here's another example. I'll give you this example. Okay, in this video, this man that you see here, he's a real estate developer, a very successful real estate developer who owns the home, actually this home here. He owns this home in a relatively well-off upper middle class neighborhood. And so this woman who's walking with her kids in the late evening is walking around in the neighborhood, and watch what happens. I'm only gonna show you about a minute or so of this, and then I wanna get your perspective.
Do you live here? Yeah. You do? I don't believe that. What? I don't believe that. Where are you going? Where are you going?
Okay. So she goes running down the street screaming for help while somehow she's at this man's house. The ring footage you're seeing is from his front door. She doesn't believe that he lives there. In this case, she's not necessarily calling people racial slurs, but you can clearly gather that some motive for why she even feels the way she feels is because of who he is and what he looks like. The fact that she can ask him, do you live here? And then she goes, I don't believe that, without ever seeing him break a window or a door or something. What do you expect her to say? What would you expect to hear from somebody where this video, again, gets out on social media, it makes its rounds, her job gets a hold of it, she's now facing the public scrutiny of her actions of somehow trying to call the police on a person who's just coming back to his own home? What would you expect her to say? Can I get the mic over to, yeah, thank you.
Going off the last video, I think she would say, he came at me a certain way, and I just didn't feel comfortable. I had my kids, like, I didn't know that this was his house. Probably just making excuses for her own actions, because that is, like, that's beyond unnecessary.
But then using the
I'm not
white
racist.
fragility prayer,
Yeah.
you would expect her to say some kind of "I'm not a racist," right? Okay, watch.
So I want to jump on here because my Facebook is public, and for those of you guys who are telling me that I owe a public apology, one, I will not apologize for making any sort of racist remark. I am the furthest thing from a racist. I will, however, apologize that my expression could ever come across in such a way, or that somebody could think something of that nature of myself and my family. So, long story short, I need to give the context because there's a lot of y'all who are, I'm sure, coming to my page right now, not like Jamie's coming down.
Okay, so you hear predictable responses, consistent responses. I could show you a video of a guy, a former Alabama governor, George Wallace, giving a speech where he says segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and then 2 years later is saying on camera, "I'm not a racist. I'm not." And he swears it, and he truly believes that. Right? So what I'm saying here is that to some extent, the psychosocial model characterizes what are very clear cut and paste textbook examples of racism that are unambiguously clear, and yet predictable responses would be, generally from a fragile white person, will be attempts to insert any kind of barrier that allows them to distance themselves from racism, even when it's their own behavior. You'll often see this at the institutional level as well. For example, there are several companies and corporations right now, Target, Walmart, Amazon, for example, that were doing the whole Pride Month thing, the Black History Month thing for like the last few years. And now suddenly DEI is taking a bunch of pressure and they're slowly starting to step back on those things, trying to distance themselves from those things, right? It is a way in which you can, kind of like gravity, this is kind of built off of a critical race theory perspective, you can make predictable assessments about what kind of behavior you would expect to find from people who engage in these ways. Right? So that's just an example of the white fragility prayer. Ultimately, the white fragility prayer makes it so that the racism, it never has a proximal location. It's never who we are. It's never where we are. We're never willing to admit that, in fact, we are racist, which is just the scientific fact, and that the racism is a kind of cultural phenomenon that we all engage in to some extent through normative behavior, through the messages we've absorbed, the lessons we've learned from the people around us, from the messages we've received growing up, right? The racism, it exists, but it's always out there somewhere. It's always someone else's problem. It's always just out of reach, and we're totally against racism, but the racism is never where we are. It's never who we are, right? I'll give you an example, an institutional example. I was once a professor at St. John's University. And St. John's University was doing this thing where they were doing internal funding for diversity, equity, and inclusion research. And there was this Asian sociology professor who basically wanted to examine how St. John's used to admit its students in the past. Right? And so the university was celebrating her work. They gave her a web page where she could compile all of her findings and things like that. But the moment this scholar dug up some documents that instructed admission staff to reject Black applicants, reject the applications of females, and limit the number of Jews that would be allowed to attend the university, what do you think the university did? Predictable outcome. What do you think they did? You can just shout it out. Yeah, shut down the site. They shut her down, completely shut her down, and she had spent about 2 years, I believe, or so, doing this work only for the university that claims to want to make changes and cares about social justice is the same university that's shutting her down the moment she starts finding that actually the racism was here, right? Racism was here, it was always here, it was a part of this university. And yes, the admission standards have clearly changed since 2020 or whatever. But the point is that they still are trying to distance themselves from the racism. You can observe this at the institutional level too, right? So this makes it so that racism, we can never tangibly resolve racism anywhere. Because if you can always just go, but like it's just out of reach and we hate racism, we're so against racism, and then somebody goes, hey, there's like racism you could fix right here. What are you gonna do about this? We gotta bury it, we've gotta silence it, we've gotta move it out of the way. We hate racism, but the racism is out there somewhere. And now imagine that everybody's doing that. All of the organizations are doing it, every individual is doing it, and then you end up with a modern day culture that somehow still has race pattern disparities, racialized outcomes. It's a highly racially segregated society, and yet nobody's a racist, right? So think about that. Okay. In general, the white fragility pair can be characterized as a range of defensive moves. You might minimize the racism. You might deny and reject that racism ever even existed in the first place. You might invalidate the significance of race or those racialized perspectives. You might shift the goalpost entirely. So at first we were talking about racism, but now we're talking about something else that has nothing to do with race, and now the attention is purely on that. Maybe we ignore the significance of race. I'll even go so far as to tell you, in a few of my sections, I won't say which ones, I had students, while I was talking about this very topic, engaging in these behaviors because you could visibly see that they're uncomfortable. Well, you know, in my experience, when I was growing up, everybody was just the same. We never paid attention to race. We never saw the significance in it or anything like that. Goalpost shifting, ignoring, rationalizing, and it's the white students.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Would you consider like you said, people focusing on something else that's irrelevant to the discussion, to move it off race, would you consider the shift to talking about class to be a version of that?
Yes. So that's all the time. I would say that race and class are two sides of the same coin. Right? Because both can be characterized as a kind of caste system. But yes, there's often this rhetorical shift that, it's not about race, it's about class, it's about something else. Well, yes, class is significant to the discussion, but right now the discussion wasn't about class, it was originally about race. Can we wrap up our discussion about that first and then talk about class? It's usually the case that class is just used to take race off the table. And so that tends to be a thing. I see that on Reddit a lot, or like on internet forums. I've seen it everywhere, even in person. And so I had a student at the end of this particular lecture literally say to me, what if like at the end of the day, I just don't care? What if like I just want to focus on my craft. I'm going to go and I'm going to do soccer, or like I'm a shoemaker or something, and like race has nothing to do with it. What then? Why do I need to learn these things? Literally, as I'm talking about this was just yesterday. Okay, so this is a thing that like, even as I'm talking to specific students about what these things even look like, there are some students who have the inclination to do them anyway. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. That part of the reason why I'm even recording, because I wanted to move the camera around, but I want to avoid the possibility of, even if I'm not showing a student's face, I don't want them to draw that kind of negative attention. So I'm trying to get a neutral recording, and that's where this is even coming from, right? Then we get to the topic of like white rage or white anger. And this is, again, also an academic term to describe a unique historical pattern of behavior often engaged by American white people, not necessarily European white people, American white people that has to do with the sort of societal and often institutional backlash that can occur whenever there is progress made towards racial equality. Or like whenever there is progress made on the equality front. Generally, it has to do with race, because we're talking about this in this regard. But it can be about gender, it can be about class, it can be about other avenues or intersects of identity. But on the racial front, it's usually where like some historical or cultural normative notion of white supremacy is challenged, or where equality is demanded, that you will often find a kind of lash out or lashback of rage and anger that seeks to prevent or resist those changes from coming to light. Does everyone recognize what's going on in this image? Do we know what happened here? Yes. Okay. This was the storming of the Capitol back in 2020, I believe, if not 2021. I can't recall. Yeah, basically you had lots of angry white people that were like seething with rage and hate after Donald Trump lost the election, and then stormed the Capitol, broke windows, assaulted police officers, smeared shit on the walls, pissed in the corners, completely made the Capitol an entire mess. But a lot of that rage wasn't just because Donald Trump lost the election. Yes, there were claims that the election was stolen and those kinds of things. But does anyone know what happened in, let's say, 10 years prior to this culmination that led up to it? Something was bubbling like a pressure cooker. Does anyone know what that was? What happened that would make racially hostile people really, really angry to the point that they want to lash out? Yes, the very first African-American president ever to be elected in the history of this country had occupied an office that, for the sake of symbolism, was really just synonymous with whiteness. To occupy the White House as president was symbolically a position for a white man. You'll even often hear that on the gender front. If a female candidate runs for president, we had Hillary Clinton run for president in the years prior, and of course she lost. But one of the contributing factors to why people would even say she lost is because she's a woman. Because the position belongs to a man. Men belong in the positions of leadership, right? The same could be said for race. And that was a lot of the criticisms thrown against, namely the Obama family, but obviously Barack Obama, was that this is a position for a white man. And if Barack Obama, let's say he gets into the Oval Office, he's going to try to engage in some kind of racial retribution. He's going to try to get revenge on all of the white people in the same ways that white people did things to his people. There were all kinds of outlandish claims being thrown around. But when he won the election twice, it was like everybody, including Donald Trump, was like seething with rage and hate in a way that everyone thought kind of disappeared prior to this particular time period. Is everyone here familiar with the birther movement? You know what the birther movement was? So leading up to the election of Barack Obama, Donald Trump had been on social media. He had been in front of news cameras, basically making the claim that Barack Obama is not eligible to become president because he's not even born in America. He's not even an American citizen. He's a Muslim. He's an Arab. He doesn't belong in this country. And if he gets access to the White House, it's basically gonna threaten American democracy. And so it created such a kerfuffle that Barack Obama ultimately had to come out and like publicize his own birth certificate, because a lot of people truly believed that he wasn't an American citizen. Right? And so then here he is, and he gets elected twice. And then on top of that, right, some historians and academics call it a kind of white lash, where ultimately he leaves office, and the very next president to step in is the one who was sowing all of the seeds of racial animosity and hate all throughout his presidency. Right? So this is one example, but I mean, that's a modern example. We could go back in history to the Reconstruction era. This is the period immediately after World War II, right? Abraham Lincoln had definitively decided that African Americans would be free and no longer enslaved, okay? And during this time, now you have, let's say the Confederacy lost the war. The country is trying to work to reunify the North with the South, okay? And now we have a number of formerly enslaved free black people all across America. And you know what they started doing? many of them, formerly enslaved people, started running for political office and winning. And with their elected positions, were working to pass laws to make themselves equal to whites. Not better than, not superior than. They were working to dismantle segregation laws, working to remove laws that codified black people as somehow being inferior. Now put yourselves in the shoes of a slaveholder. If you're a slaveholder, you just lost the war, you lost ownership of all of your human capital, and now you see some of your slaves, your former slaves, running for political office and winning, and they're trying to pass laws to make themselves equal to you. How would you feel? Be honest, how would you feel? Pissed the fuck off, right? Okay, so this is where the KKK gets started. In 1866, they are comprised of these angry, disenfranchised former Confederates who are trying to save America and save the South because they see that American democracy is under peril. And how do they see it under peril? It's because these formerly enslaved black people who they've always known to be beneath them, to be subordinate to them, are now trying to pass laws to make themselves equal. Well, no, we can't have that. So what does the KKK start doing? They start assassinating some of these black political leaders. They start assassinating some of the white Republicans that were helping these black political leaders. They start showing up at the voter polls, intimidating voters, burning crosses, lynching people, raping people, maiming them. And the KKK truly saw themselves as the good guys. They're out to save the South, to save America. And that's genuinely how they felt. That is an example of this kind of white rage or white anger. It even goes beyond that. There's countless examples from then all the way up until, let's say, the desegregation of public schools. But now let's get to the civil rights era, right? Where the Supreme Court has just recently ruled that all public schools must be desegregated on a constitutional basis, okay? So they have determined it is unconstitutional to racially restrict people from accessing public spaces, to which then the response to most of the white public is outrage. They're pissed. They're spitting on these kids. They're hanging nooses. They're threatening to hang these children, right? Some of these people that are pissed off, not the army members, I can't speak for them, but many of the members of the public, you see the sign here, race mixing is communism. These are the conservatives actively resisting attempts or moves towards racial equality. And they're pissed, right? A kind of outlash, a kind of anger. And if they know now for what they know, it's unconstitutional to say no Mexicans, no niggers, whites only, colored section in the back, these kinds of things. Maybe since they can't do that anymore, they start pressuring their politicians to change laws that make it harder for these kinds of kids to go to school with them. Maybe they start pressuring politicians to make it so that these kinds of people stay out of their communities, stay out of their neighborhoods, and cannot access their schools. And their schools can technically be segregated, but still be all white. Right? And that's what that looks like. This is conservatism before conservatives moved over to the Republican Party. Democrats were historically conservative all the way from the time of the Reconstruction era until the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. When a Democrat president signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, all of the conservatives were so pissed off that they abandoned the Democrat Party and started voting Republican in droves. And that's where they stay today. Where you then get today, modern, they call themselves conservative, angry white people who still favor the preservation of the Confederacy, who will shout with tiki torches and covering their faces, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." We hate diversity and inclusion. We think it's anti-white, these kinds of things. Does anyone know what happened here? This was in 2017. Were any of you old enough to kind of pay attention? Yeah. Can I please get the microphone to, yeah, thank you. What happened?
Yeah, I definitely remember this. There was like a group of white supremacists with like all of their torches that were like going through the town, and it eventually led to violence, and there were counter protests, and somebody came in and drove a car through the crowd and killed a woman protester.
Yep, exactly. Thank you for that. Do you know what they were protesting?
Oh, I don't remember.
No worries. So this obviously took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. A lot of the states that had historically seceded from the Union, which started the Civil War, they tend to memorialize the Confederate leaders. So Charlottesville, Virginia had a kind of diversity and inclusion ordinance that passed that required for the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue. Okay? Robert E. Lee was one of the Confederate generals and leaders of the Confederate Army. So this statue had been there for quite some time, but an ordinance was passed to remove it, and it triggered this response from these angry white conservative protesters who wanted this Confederate statue to stay up. Now, originally, no one was protesting the removal of this thing other than them, but because they came out marching with tiki torches saying Jews and you will not replace us, it launched a kind of counter-protest, and over the course of 3 days, here's what happened. Let's see if this plays the Ghirardelli commercial. Let's see.
I took two things that I love, dancing and dogs, and I made them into a successful business.
Check this out.
10 o'clock Friday night, hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia, protesting plans to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The overnight violence spilling into this morning when marchgoers and counter-protesters clashed again, hours before the Unite to Right march was even set to begin. Just after 10:30 a.m., the crowd growing in size. Local and state police in riot gear responding in force, but the violence escalating. Just before noon, Virginia's governor declaring a state of emergency. Just before 2 p.m., the situation taking that deadly turn.
You can see the silver 2010 Dodge Challenger barreling down the hill toward a sea of targets with little time to react, slamming to a stop only after it hit a van and another car. Locked in, that car shifting in reverse, screeching back down the street to get away. One person, a 32-year-old woman, left dead. 19 more rushed to the hospital, 5 in critical condition. The suspected driver, 20-year-old James Alex Fields Jr., is behind bars.
The first response from the White House came not from the president, but the First Lady. She tweeted, "Our country encourages freedom of speech, but let's communicate without hate in our hearts."
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
Senator Ted Cruz put out his own statement calling the attack a grotesque act of domestic terrorism. Senator John McCain tweeted, "White supremacists aren't patriots, they're traitors."
Racism is evil, and those who cause violence in its name are criminals and thugs. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers. I think if we continue to create jobs at levels that aren't creating jobs, I think that's going to have a tremendously positive impact on race relations. I do.
Thoughts? Comments? Right? So it's not like the white supremacy is in yesteryear. Just because you can see black and white photos, we can talk about the Reconstruction era, white supremacy is still very much alive and growing in the modern era, the modern political era. And as I told you, right, some of those angry conservatives that were pissed off that public schools were desegregated and they could no longer explicitly discriminate on the basis of race, they would start pressuring politicians to make the appropriate changes to cement their control over the preservation of the racial status quo. And one of the ways that you see this is through like legislative measures like gerrymandering. Does anyone know what gerrymandering is? Yeah? Okay, a few of you. In general, gerrymandering is the redistricting of specific areas within a county in order to manipulate an outcome. And if you're listening to any political news, it doesn't matter if it's Fox News or NPR or CNN or something like that, whenever you hear gerrymandering, the discussion will always be accompanied by race. And it usually has to do with watering down the significance of a black majority vote. Okay, that's usually the case. Very rarely is it Hispanic or Latino voters. Okay, but I'll give you an example. Here we have on this picture on the left here, don't necessarily equate red for Republican and blue for Democrat. Let's just say red versus blue here. Okay, you have one county with no districts and 50 precincts. And within these precincts, you have a clear outcome where blue overwhelmingly wins compared to red. If we draw district lines between each of these precincts evenly, we still have where blue wins all 5 of the districts. But the moment we start arbitrarily drawing lines wherever we see fit, especially strategically to manipulate an outcome, you can manipulate the outcome such that in the very same example, red overpowers blue and therefore red is the winner. This is an example of gerrymandering. For some reason, this is legal and has been legal in the United States for quite some time. But in addition to that, it's not just gerrymandering, it's voter suppression. I had a student in one of my classes say he's from Texas. And when he was from Texas, he was required to request a mail-in ballot 6 months before the election. And he wasn't notified that his mail-in ballot would be canceled until 2 days before the election, which if you're making plans or you have some other things you have to do, now you have to show up to the polls in person. Well, he couldn't show up to the polls in person, so he couldn't vote. Right? It's like manipulating an outcome through voter suppression. Perhaps if it's not through those means, maybe you live in the state where they outlaw or they make it illegal to give voters who are standing in line water while they're waiting in line to vote, right? Which has happened in the state of Georgia. Okay, so these things kind of happen, and they happen in a way that they are seeking to manipulate a specific outcome, and that outcome is generally the one that preserves or conserves the racial status quo. Okay, sometimes it's not institutional responses, sometimes it can be social or cultural backlash, right? With public or media narratives that seek to paint advocacy groups as if they're like fundamentally anti-American, even though they capture the interests of all Americans as a plurality rather than just as a particular singular group. But now I want to ask you a question on this front about politics, especially politics in the modern era and white supremacy. I show you this picture right here. This is Congress in 2016 taking their oaths of office. Okay? Which political party do you think is on the top, and which political party do you think is on the bottom?
A political party. It's a little bit different where I'm from, but like I'm guessing the bottom is conservative. Is that one of them?
Yeah.
And then the top is I think only just because I see more white people on the bottom.
Yeah, sure. So the reason why you're saying the Republican Party here is because...
Or Republican, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, but they're conservative. But the reason why you're saying that is because... Why?
Kind of just because I see a lot more white people on the bottom, which is what I would picture it to be.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Can I get the mic to Mia, please? Sorry.
I personally wasn't looking at the people, I was looking at the colors, and the bottom is more red, and then the top is more blue.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, sure. But these are the Democrats, these are the Republicans, and one of the reasons why most people say that is kind of along the lines of what said even in my last few classes. That is because what you see here is a kind of plurality of Americans. You see white men, white women, black men, black women, Asian people, a woman with a hijab, right? This is what America actually looks like, right? This is a diverse political party. And then on the bottom here, you have racial and nearly gender homogeneity. It's really just white men, right? Okay. And so if you want to think about how these political parties came to even be what they are, it's rooted in history, where part of the perhaps uncomfortable truth is that whether you like it or not, clearly what you can see here is that conservatism in America really is white supremacy politics. It always has been. There's never been a point, regardless of the political party, whether the conservatives were the Democrats or whether the conservatives were the Republicans, that doesn't matter. Conservatism was always the constant. And it was always devoted to preserving and maintaining the racial status quo. This is why the political motives of the current presidential administration, as well as the subsequent Senate and House, are overwhelmingly passing anti-DEI measures. So for some reason, they're anti-diversity. Why? Well, because for some reason that appears to be a threat to white control and white power, right? Okay, this is why you see things the way you do. Now, the rationale will often be that they're trying to maintain law and order, maintain their tradition. Usually there's some kind of appeal or evocation to tradition and traditional values and our cultural heritage and these kinds of things, right? This is why they are fundamentally anti-transgender, is because it appears to be a threat to traditionalism in this regard. But what you see here is racial homogeneity, where you see a plurality of individuals by contrast. This is race politics. That's what that is. Right? Okay. So when we talk about white supremacy, I just said to you, this is American conservatism is white supremacy politics, and I truly mean that. And there's a historical academic justification for that. When you hear the term white supremacy in the academic sense, don't think of the KKK. I'm not saying that every party that you just saw in those pictures is a member of the KKK. That's not what I'm saying. What we're talking about is a comprehensive system of power that works to produce and sustain white privilege, white economic power, social power, geopolitical power, and control, okay? And that is kind of anthropologically symbolized by the, the comprehensive comprise of the faces that you see according to their political values and according to their political strivings, right? Right? Okay, so this is what we mean when we talk about white supremacy. I want to jump into this video really quick because I want to jump into the last little bit of our time, and with the time we have left, I want to talk about get your thoughts on this video anyway. This is the scholar Robin DiAngelo. You're reading, or you're assigned to read 2 chapters from her book, and we're going to watch this, and then on the back end we'll talk about it. Okay.
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us. Because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men. I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case, racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power. And so prior to the civil rights movement, it was fairly socially acceptable for white people to just come out and say, we are superior. My father certainly was comfortable saying that. The great joke of Archie Bunker and all of the family was that he wasn't up with the times and he was still saying things that conveyed this idea. But post-civil rights, it became bad to be racist, right? It became unacceptable to be racist. And that seems like a positive thing, right? Racism's bad. But unfortunately, what it morphed into is to make it impossible for white people to look at racism, because what we hear is, I would have to be a bad person in order to perpetuate racism. It became a moral issue. In addition to years of reflection and study of my own racial identity and how it shapes my life and my experience and my perspectives, I've had the very rare opportunity to, for a living, day in and day out, lead primarily white groups of people in discussions of race and racism. And there are some very, very predictable patterns that come up in these conversations. And as I listen to these, it's almost like a script, right? Like it's almost as if as white folks, we just pick up this script and we say the same things again and again and again. And as a sociologist, rather than seeing something that's patterned as meaning therefore it's true, I look at something patterned as very revealing of how we get socialized to see things and to see the world. And then the next question that follows that is, and so how does that function? Right? And when we look around us, we can see that although we have changes since the civil rights movement and we have this idea of racism being bad, we still have the same unequal outcomes by race. By every measure, we have racial inequality. So how do we have such different narratives than we had prior to the civil rights movement and still have unequal outcomes? And as I listen to white folks, my group, repeat these narratives over and over, I got this image of a dock, like a pier, and it's just floating on the water, and that's all the superficial things that we say. And you probably recognize some of these, you hear them, maybe you've said them yourself. I don't see color, I was taught to treat everybody the same, I don't care if you're pink, blue, purple, polka dotted. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. Or my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. It doesn't really matter what goes in front of it. The answer is always, I'm not racist. I know people of color. I used to work in the military. All of the things we say to rationalize that we ourselves are not complicit in this system. Now, I want to speak to two of these before I kind of take us below the surface of the dock. And one is this idea that our parents taught us to treat everyone the same. And I am just going to put it out there like this. No, they didn't. That is not humanly possible. Human beings are not objective. You cannot be taught to treat or to see everyone the same. And when you say that, you're indicating that you don't understand how socialization works, which is actually a positive thing in the sense that that can direct what you would need to focus on if you want to get deeper understanding. The other one I want to speak to is this common trope of, I don't care if you're pink, purple, polka dotted. If that's in your vocabulary, I would urge you to please drop it and never say it again. Although it isn't intentional, it's actually very demeaning. People don't come in those colors, and what it conveys is that you're not prepared to engage with authenticity. Okay? And that's why I have this image of a dog, right? That's very superficial surface. And for me, in trying to understand how all this works, what it means to be white, and live so separate by race, even though I was taught to see myself individually as open-minded and outside of all of this, I've had to go under the surface. And that's why I have this image here now of under the water. You see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface. Okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color, okay? And so we're giving you evidence. Right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same, but we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say, we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences because racism is real. And while race isn't real, in other words, at the biological level, there is no real, true race or racial difference as we're taught to understand it, these very superficial signifiers of racial difference that allow us to categorize people, these are very real in their consequences for people's lives. And this insistence that we're all one doesn't allow us to engage with that social reality. I try to help white people see how race functions in our lives. And I try to move us away from the really obvious, evident examples, such as a racist joke or a racist action, or things that would be recognizable to everybody, right? The kinds of acts that cause people like me, well-meaning people like me, to say, I couldn't possibly be racist, I don't do those things. And I try to help white people understand racism as the very fabric of our society. And I think the most profound example of everyday racism is segregation. that most white people live in racial segregation. While we may work with people of color, when we go home, people of color are rarely at our dinner table. And I don't mean setting our table. I mean sitting and breaking bread with us, true relationships in our lives. Many people can recognize the explicit, kind of conscious dislike type of racism, racist jokes, racist expressions, the KKK. But I want to help white people see the everyday racism that's embedded and that we participate in. And I want to look at neighborhood and school segregation as an example. I'm going to start with this app here. These are the app's founders. It's a new app called The Sketch Factor. And what it does is when you go to a new city, you can put in where you are, and it tells you which neighborhoods to avoid because they're sketchy. And of course, sketchy is very much associated with race and class in the white mind. And so now we have the convenience of segregation through an app. We don't actually have to talk to other white people about, where are the good neighborhoods and the bad neighborhoods. And that good neighborhood, bad neighborhood, good schools, bad schools discourse is an example of new racism. I don't think it gets by anybody that is racially coded language. So this way we can come out and police those racial boundaries without ever kind of naming race. But we all know what we're talking about. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation. And in a lot of ways, we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color. That is the way that white people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is. And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation, and not have one single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound and I really want us to sit with it. That I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I follow the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me in my good neighborhood and my good school and my good college and my good career in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color, and not one person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss. Just sit with that for a moment, that there is no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. If my parents, if my schools, if my curriculum, if my teachers, if my government saw value in those perspectives, I would be given those perspectives, but I wasn't given those perspectives. And that shapes my relationships. It shapes what I care about. It shapes what I see, what I don't see, who I build my life with, and who I don't build my life with. And that is the level where we really need to look at race inside of us and with us. In the line of work that I do, it's a breakthrough if you can get white people to acknowledge that our race privileges us in this society, right? That is like the second coming, to get white folks to admit that we are privileged by our race. But even that begins to get superficial. And you'll hear white people say, just because of the color of my skin, I have these things, as if this is just an accident that happens. And I want to take us deeper. I want to take us inside this skin. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That is what I call this system. I don't mean the KKK. I mean a system in which whiteness and white people are central and seen as inherently superior to people of color. My personality was formed in that water. My worldview was formed in that water. I didn't choose it. It isn't my fault. I'm not racked with guilt about it, but I am responsible for changing it because the default of our society is the reproduction of racism. It's built into every system and every institution. And if we just live our lives and carry on in the most comfortable ways for us, we will necessarily reproduce it. There is no neutral space. Inaction is a form of action. One of the most effective adaptations of racism since the civil rights era is this idea of a racist is a bad person, and if you're not racist, you're a good person. What I call the good-bad binary. And we can all fill it in, right? So if you're racist, then you're prejudiced and mean-spirited and bigoted and ignorant and Southern and probably drive a pickup truck. So we got some classism in there, right? This is our racist. And if you're not racist, you're good and you're progressive and you're open-minded and you're educated and you're northern. And this binary is probably the #1 construct that keeps racism today in place and makes it nearly impossible to talk to white people about racism. The defensiveness we have comes from this binary. What we hear is, you just said I was a bad person. And so this binary sets it up to be mutually exclusive. You cannot be a good person and be complicit with racism. So you'll notice in the news when racism gets talked about, they'll bring in the evidence they'll have to defend the person that's being accused of racism is, but he's a really nice person, right? Because again, it's mutually exclusive. We have to understand racism as a system that we're all a part of. You know, I often, in my trainings, after I kind of laid out kind of how racism works, I'll ask people of color, how often have you given white people feedback on our inevitable, unaware and unintentional, but inevitable racism, and have that go well for you? And you know, there's eye rolls and laughter, and basically the answer is never. Right? It's virtually impossible for people of color to give us feedback because that binary sets us up to defend, right? I must, at all costs, deflect and establish that I am not racist, right? And that makes it so that we can't examine the reality of the society that we live in. Right? And then I'll follow up and ask this question. So what would your daily life be like? This is a question I ask the people of color. If you could simply give us feedback when we step in it, which we inevitably will, and have us receive that with grace, reflect, and seek to do something different, what would your daily life be like? And recently, a man of color in the room, there was a pause, and then he said, it would be revolutionary. And I just want you to sit with that for a minute. Revolutionary, that white people would receive the feedback, reflect, and try to change our behavior. That would be a revolution.
All right, I want to pause there. You can watch the rest of the video. I just, for the sake of time, I want to squeeze in thoughts, feelings, comments, perspectives on this. Anything you want to say? You have no feelings about this at all?
I'll go.
Yeah, just talk on the microphone.
I feel like she's right. Like, I feel like people do have just opinions without like understanding what they actually mean. But something that did stick out to me was that that app that she said had like areas that were unsafe, and it's like, what does that look like? And it's like, I mean, I just, from the way society is, I guess I would say there's probably a lot of Black people or like Mexican in the area, so that's why it's unsafe. But yeah, that's something that stood out to me.
This video is a few years old, but when this originally came out, the sketch factor was under like a lot of hot spotlight. The app ultimately got canceled, and the reason was because you could take what they were calling a sketchy area and just overlay it with a demographic map, and generally it was those racially segregated Black and brown neighborhoods that they were calling sketchy. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I really agree with how she says that like white people view themselves as like not a race, like they're not like it's like people of color and then white people, and that's the norm. White people is the norm.
Yeah.
And we like people of color go along with like the norm of white people.
Yeah. And then what ends up happening is you kind of see that dynamic play out a little bit in our two-party system, where it ends up being racially diverse with white people included, but it's mostly people of color. And then there's one particular political party that's just for white people. Yeah. Can I pass it back to? Let's hear Dan, and then we'll head out.
I was just gonna say, like, I think she does like a good job of explaining how, like, white privilege isn't just like an individual action or anything. It's sort of just the way things are sort of like structured to benefit white people in a way.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you. And so we'll leave it there. Just a reminder, when we come back, there are 4 readings, okay? It's about 60 pages worth of readings.